Sometime I'm going to have to talk to you. I've been meaning to find out where because I'm kind of the same way, where your 13.7 billion years on the universe beginning came from.
Where it came from?
Kind of get more.
Where scientists come from, or why come to the belief?
Well, I thought
come to the belief.
that's what you said.
Yeah. I don't know if you meant that's how they originally did it. Or, yeah. Well, some of that I alluded to, but there are a few reasons. One of the major reasons is because that light itself is a constant. In a vacuum, it is. And so in the vacuum of space, they can measure, because it's the same speed no matter what. And because it's the constant speed, you can measure the degree to which it goes forward or comes backward based on signals, based on, just like a mirror laser. But you can also measure with, thank you, baby, with accuracy, when light, thank you, baby, when it goes a certain distance, certain waves of the light stretch out. Which is why early on, bright light is white because it's right in your face. Okay. So that's why it looks white to us. It's so fast. And then it gets blue and purple and gold and magenta all the way down to, and when the farthest way, it's almost like the light stretches out, but it's not. It's just the way the longer waves seem almost kind of the back end of it. Those are red. Okay. It's called the red shift. And they can measure how the distance it would need to be to have that exact color. Mm-hmm. And there are stars and planets that they measure that. I mean, the telescopes hit the same planet over and over and over and over, and they can see it actually. That's what Hubble's in the 30s was such a big discovery. It's because when he measured the exact same planets, the same stars, and they measured exactly down to the millimeter on a map and all that stuff, they realized that redshift we measured, and it's that the universe is not only is it expanding because planets are getting farther apart, they're becoming more red, which means they're getting farther from our eye. Not only is it doing that, it's speeding up. So it's surprising that it was expanding because that means if you rewind the tape backwards at the beginning. And what's very surprising, there's still a complete mystery is why is it speeding up? But the main thing is the red shift is the main distance. Well, they can measure that in a vacuum. They can measure down with incredible accuracy of how many millions of light years away it must be. Okay. And you just do the math. And so then the math ends up being a little over 13 billion years old. Okay. And so typical people who believe in the young Earth almost always go to carbon dating. And it's true that carbon dating is not consistent. That is true. That's true. I mean, they do carbon dating on one part of the same piece and sometimes come differently. It's just, well, one thing is I don't think, based on the research I've done, it's not as inaccurate and unstable as a lot of people like to make it be. Scientists trust it very often. And the reason why I know that is because, particularly when it comes to paleography, which we'll talk about manuscripts, paleography is the art and science of studying handwritten material. So paleographers who study that all the time, and their whole specialty is to figure out which century someone wrote a document in, because just like all script, it changes over time. When a paleographer sees a document, and they also do carbon dating, they're almost always the same. Oh, okay. Carbon dating goes down to about to the century, so we can't go down to the decade or a year. You know, my point is there are many. What's that?
It's a pretty wide range.
It's a wide range. That's right. It sure is. It can be from 50 to 100 years around that. But what's staggering, what people who have, in my experience, people have a strong agenda to demonstrate the Earth is young, go to all the examples that carbon dating was wrong. They overlook all the times it was clearly accurate. That we know for a fact from other evidences, we know an event happened in the 18th century, carbon dating dated to that. Or we know that someone can look at us and go, oh, this is 3rd century, you carbon date it's 3rd century. That is independently. That is, they don't know what, they just give something they're dating it. So many times that's accurate, sometimes it's inaccurate, and that's true. But that's not the main reason why scientists believe the universe is doing as well, because of carbon dating. That wouldn't help you at all. Carbon dating helps you the date of the planet. And most scientists think the date of the planet's a few billion years old for various reasons, but it's not necessarily because of carbon dating. But the age of the universe is not a carbon issue, because that's much more about redshift. Yeah.
I didn't mean to get you off.
No, it's fine. No, we're stalling.
About ready to go.
We're stalling. No, that's good. Okay. Well, hopefully not just stalling, but anyway, that's why. That's the main reason why. And that backs up Einstein's theory. Of course, E equals MC squared. His theory of relativity, which also involves, of course, the speed of light, it is the most affirmed scientific equation in the history of science. I think there's over 30-something independently tested scientific apparatus tools set up to prove what he said. Mm-hmm. So it's one of those things in science where it's just nobody doubts it. It's absolutely certain that the speed of light is constant in a vacuum and all those things. And so I don't know. So I don't find it to be problematic at all. But more problematic I find, very much more problematic I find, are people who read Genesis, in my view, incorrectly. So I don't have a problem with science telling me things because I don't think the Bible is a science textbook. I don't think any part of the Bible is a science textbook. So, and that's a genre issue, and that's a very different issue. So I don't have a theological axe to grind, if that makes sense. Yeah.
So there's a scientist that when the eclipse was happening 5 years ago or something like that, there's a astrologist, or no, not the astrologist, the true scientist.
Astronomer.
There you go.
Astronomer.
There you go. He said that light speeds up at times. Have you ever heard that?
Yeah, it seems to that or slow down depending on the force of gravity. For example, light stretches to infinite basically in a black hole. So gravity is so strong in a black hole, light can't even escape it. Because the gravity, whatever that they're not exactly sure what exactly it is yet, but the force of gravity is so strong, light can't even escape, which is why it's black. So in that sense, but again, that's my point before, it's not a vacuum. Light's a constant in a vacuum, which means there's no force of gravity, it's not getting distorted that way. So light can distort, it can change, but in a vacuum it's not, and that's the difference when you measure it in such a way. And they can tell, usually it'll go for a long time, but you can tell when sometimes even light goes around something, it's called perturbations, and you can tell when it changes. And when there's a slight wobble, that's a rotation. And sometimes it means the black hole's in front of it or behind it or planets around it. Sometimes a black hole, if light's going towards you and it hits a black hole, it warps.
Really?
It warps around it. And all this stuff, I'm just an amateur, but people who study all the time, that's all.
Huh.
Good. Well, instead of doing a big review, I'm going to start where we did last week, if that's okay. We picked up, I think we're on external data. So this is where we're talking about Christianity. I think the historical evidence of Christianity makes this very probable. Of all the world religions, I think Christianity has the most historical evidence. And so we're looking at external data first and then going to internal. External is, think about it this way, it's the stuff. It's the stuff of the manuscripts and so forth. So this is a manuscript. I know it's a little review. It's okay. Hopefully this isn't too boring to hear it again. But manuscript means it's handwritten. They're very ancient, and they're written in a short time period. This is P52, Papyrus 52, which is about the size of a credit card. It's from the Gospel of John. And just to be clear about this, when I do this study on how to read the Bible for all it's worth, I'll talk about this some more. But just in case you never heard this before, your Bible you have right now, how many have a Bible? You have a Bible near you, okay? You probably all have what's called the Protestant canon. The Protestant canon, from kanon in Greek, basically means a ruler. It became used to mean a measure of the standard by which you judge other things. So canon, doesn't mean a bomb thing, but a canon's different. You have the Protestant canon, which means the Protestant Reformation. That's their collection, a list, their rule of authoritative text in the church. Well, there are multiple canons in the church. There are about 4 or 5 major canons around the world. There's the Protestant canon, the Roman Catholic canon, the Orthodox canon, the Ethiopic canon, and there's the Slavic canon, and there's about 4 or 5 major ones, and there's some minor ones. All the different canons are different because they include more books. The Protestant has the least. We have 66 in ours. Everyone else has more, which means they have other books that they think are authoritative for the life of the Christian. So someone says, well, the Bible's blank. As soon as they say the Bible's whatever. My first question, usually they're saying that in such a way where it's the inerrant Word of God. I say, which one? Everyone who says that, I guarantee you, that means they're a Protestant. It never occurs to them. There are a billion or so people around the planet who disagree with them on which canon is authoritative. But no matter what, we all have something in common. All of our canons come from various manuscripts, most of which were papyrus, the earliest kind of form like a paper from the papyrus plant. And they originally were in scrolls, and then they put into a sheet. And this is called a codex, when it's a book form, the spine on the bottom is codex. So, for example, my Greek and English New Testament right here, the pages are folded and glued at the bottom. And your Bible's probably very similar to that. They're in groups, and that's what happens. Well, the Christians did not, they might have invented it. They probably did not invent it, but they sure made it popular. The dominant way Christians collected their sacred text was the codex form. Romans and Greeks did not do that. They preferred the scroll for centuries after the Christians were always using the Bible. The codex was formed in the Roman world for people who were going to school. It was used for like textbooks and writing manuals, things like that. But it wasn't wildly popular for literature at all. The Christians made it popular. And there's theories of why they did that, and I won't go there right now because I go for a long time. I'm trying to get bogged down. But I want to make sure you hear this, that when you see your canon, your Bible, which is a library, a collection of your Protestant canon, 66 books, Old Testament, New Testament, we call it. What scholars do are called textual critics. They, like Indiana Jones, kind of. They have discovered different manuscripts like this, but a whole fact, which I'll show you another later on tonight, whole pages and pages, some ancient Bibles, particularly from the early 300s, the early 4th century. And they get these different papyrus scripts and scrolls all together on a proverbial big table, and they study which one is the most ancient, which one goes backwards the most ancient. And I'll talk more about that in just a second. But I'm letting you know, that's what your Bible is. Your Bible is a patchwork quilt full of various papyrus groups and some other things that are collected all together. So when you read your Bible, and you probably have an English translation, not only as a bunch of people, nerds like myself, went to school for a long, long, long time. I only had one class in PhD on textual criticism. There are people who spend their entire career, they're specialists in it. And they all of their work is to try to get the actual manuscripts. What is the actual manuscripts? They're still being discovered every once in a while. The modern English translation that I know of that's the most up to date is the one I prefer the most, which is the New English Translation, the NET. And there's some in the called the Catholic Epistles and James and 1-2 Peter, Hebrews, that are very, they were only discovered a few years ago. Little portions of different words. We get a little more clarity over time. So that's what your Bible is. It's a bunch of these things put together. And then, of course, a committee or a person translated it from the Greek or the Hebrew into your Bible, your modern Bible. Most people's Bibles, like, is that the NIV Study Bible? What is that?
Yeah.
NIV Study Bible, that came from a committee from Zondervan. They're a very conservative, maybe fundamentalist group. Which one is yours?
That's what I was looking.
ESV.
Yeah.
The ESV is also conservative fundamentalist. ESV is produced also by Zondervan or Crossway. I think they were similar. What you got?
NASB.
The NASB. So that's a New American Standard Bible. It's also by committee. And so is this. The Greek is a Nestle Aland. It's the standard and scholarship. And my English side is the Revised Standard Version, which is also by committee of scholars who know Greek and for the New Testament and be in Latin, and if the Old Testament, Hebrew. So we're talking about the actual pieces of things we get to. My first reason why I think we can trust the manuscript. Now, just because there are a lot of manuscripts doesn't mean the story's true. It can be really, really, really good manuscripts for fairy tales or unicorn stories. We're not there yet. That's the internal data. We're not there yet, right? That's the story itself. Is the story trustworthy to have happened? Right now we're trying to figure out, can we trust that it actually was ever written down and it was copied correctly? And so I gave the example of if you're dismissing the Bible or even the New Testament, if you dismiss it as ridiculous and there's no way, why even trust it at all? Well, then you've got to dismiss everything we know about the ancient world because, as I said last week, their time periods are much worse. Much, much worse. So we have things like Homer's Iliad, the earliest manuscripts that we have around 400 BC. Well, those are old, but he wrote it around 800 BC. So there's a 400-year gap between the earliest pieces of paper we got, papyrus, when it was written. It's 400 years. No one doubts Homer's Iliad. No one really doubts it. We have all, and of course the Roman, like the Livy and Tacitus, and of course Thucydides, Herodotus at the top. These were written, some of these are 1,000 years between when that guy sat down and wrote them out and the copies we have that we found in Europe. Some of these things are 1,300 years removed, but scholars always, he probably wrote that. 1,000 years. No one goes, forget it. There's no way we'll ever know what Thucydides ever wrote or Herodotus. Historians don't do that. They do not do that. When it comes to the New Testament, we have what they call an embarrassment of riches. We've got almost 6,000 manuscripts. Now, a lot of them are fragmentary, but nevertheless we have thousands of them. And they are the earliest manuscripts we have within a few hundred years of each other. Does that make sense so far what I'm saying? So from the earliest copies that you go to a library and look at to when it was actually penned. So for example, this P52 was written probably around 110 AD. Most scholars put John's Gospel in the 80s or 90s. I think it was earlier, but let's say it's that later date of, let's say it's 90. So within 30 to 40 years of John having composed it, whomever that was, well, that's a long story, this copy came out. So this could be a copy of the original, or it could be a copy of a copy of the copy, we don't know. But it's only within a few decades. So whoever's first eyeball saw this manuscript, that means like their grandparents' age was around the time of Jesus. We're not talking, that's close. That's close. Now, and I used Bruce Metz, who was probably the best New Testament scholar of the whole 20th century. And then he said basically, no one doubts Herodotus or Thucydides because they worked on 1,300 later than the originals. Everyone goes to them and say, what did Herodotus say? He's a Roman historian. What did he say? We take it seriously. No one assumes we can't trust it. Now, what really matters, I mean, it all matters, but these are all manuscripts by century. And so a lot of the manuscripts we possess are late. So what we call late, 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th century, which of course is 1,300 years, 1,500 years after they were originally composed. That's when most of them came because of the monasteries, the monks who copied them religiously. The earlier we get, the closer we get to the original documents, we have fewer manuscripts, and they're more fragmentary. But of course they are, because they didn't last that long. But nevertheless, we do get close. We get close, and we have these numbers matter the most. And again, like I said last week, what's interesting is when you find these documents, now none of these documents are identical. None of them are. There's tons of spelling errors and copy errors all over the place. But the content and the major things we find in general, they're all corroborated. No one finds a manuscript and goes, what? Jesus was a woman? Nothing happens like that. Not even close to that. There might be differences on a word or a phrase, and we'll talk about more of that in a second. So my first point is the manuscripts are ancient, and they're written from the original. They're real close to the original time of the originals. So that makes it very likely. I'm going to listen very carefully to what this says. So any questions or comments about that? Kind of fast, but that was kind of a review. Any questions? If you do the study with me, how to read the Bible for all it's worth, or if your small group does it, we will slow down on these points and we'll reflect more on that, and I think it'd be helpful. And I'll actually take you to the Bible. We'll look at different verses to prove my point, and you'll say, oh, I see more what he's... But because of time, that's all. Number two, the other reason why I think historical Christianity, the external data, why we can trust the New Testament, is accurately reporting what the original people wanted us to read. The manuscripts come from different regions of the empire with different families. And of manuscripts, for example, they're called families, Alexandrian, Western, Byzantine, and they take us back to the 2nd century. So what that means, no, I don't. Okay. This is kind of hard to explain, except when you examine the texts that are discovered, a textual critic looks at these manuscripts, and let's say he's got 500 different manuscripts in front of him. He can notice some texts have the exact same spelling error. These 12 are identical in that they have the exact same spelling error. These 85 have the exact same issue here. These 45, and what they found is when they find more manuscripts, they realize they start fitting in certain camps. They have patterns. We call those families. And when you have different families, what that implies is that, and from different parts of the empire, of the Roman Empire, it means these manuscripts at some point traveled and were copied, like say in Rome or around Rome. And that's usually for the Western. Alexandria means Alexandria, Egypt. So that was a big place where they copied. Byzantine in the East. So when you take all these families, it means if you compare and contrast them, they're all back. They're based on more original ones. So you can work backwards. This means, unlike what people say on the radio and YouTube and whatever, you'll hear this often, there was never an orchestrated attempt by the church to suppress or change the manuscripts. Never, ever, ever. There was no church structure like that for centuries. So that it is impossible. Well, the church, I think it was the Da Vinci Code and some other, it's nonsense. It's just historical nonsense. Well, they didn't want you to read it, so they hid all those documents from you. There are no secret documents. In PhD, you're forced to read everything. There's no secret chamber. The popes locked it all up. It didn't work that way. It didn't work that way. The Roman Catholic Roman Catholic branch of Christianity didn't really take on its full authority in the West until Rome fell in 410 in LR. But anyway, it's the 5th century. Now, that was powerful, but in the East, they were doing their own thing. Down in Alexandria, Egypt, doing their own thing. So the Pope was not authoritative for the world. He still isn't authoritative for the world. He was authoritative for people near and dear to Rome. So even if the Roman Catholic Church wanted to suppress something, they were going to fail miserably at it because they didn't rule the world. The Eastern Church did their own thing, Alexandrian. And so that's when you have all these different families, you can trust that you're going backward and backwards. If these 3 different families have things in common, they all have something in common, that means they all go back to a really, really early thing. And that's very important to understand. Now, these different families are very close. For example, the various families of texts like P75, Papyrus 75, it has major portions of Luke and John. And you compare that to Codex Vaticanus, and that has almost every book in the Old New Testament. They're very close to each other. But that's 2 different families. They're very close. That means they're both dependent upon an earlier manuscript coming from the 2nd century. And then, when they correlate that with what's called Codex Sinaiticus, it's especially likely that an early archetype was used and recreated. The point is, when this is similar to this one and similar to this one, those 3 are similarities based on a similar original. That's very, very important to understand. And I thought I had a picture about that. I did. I'm not sure. I guess I didn't put it in.
Draw one.
Nah, that's all right. Well, I guess I could draw one. But I'm going to move on unless you have any questions. Does that basically make sense?
The only question I got is, so does the Dead Sea Scrolls fit into what you're talking about?
Good question. Do the Dead Sea Scrolls fit into what I'm talking about? Not for the Bible, no, because they were composed about this. Well, before the New Testament. The Dead Sea Scrolls were composed before the New Testament. We know that for a fact because the dating itself. For a fact. Because the Dead Sea Scrolls are where they were found. They were found in caves. And the usual theory is they were found, for a lot of reasons why, that they were stashed in these caves because the Romans were coming after them. And the Romans came after them in the year AD 70. But the earliest documents we have of copies come from around close to the 1st century. So right around the time of Jesus, a little before, a few decades before. But not during the time of the New Testament. Okay. Not after the 1st century they seem to be done. No good. But they also have manuscripts, and we study those, and those are all in Hebrew, and so forth. Yeah. A third thing is, so this is really important, which means you can't trust the Bible. The Roman Catholic Church suppressed it. I'm saying that's absolutely demonstrably false, completely false. Third, it's not the telephone game. You know the telephone game? Is that what y'all call it, Illinois? I don't know. I like red apples, and someone else whispers, I like red apples. It goes around the room, I like red apples. What did you say? Your mom's a horse. What? What did you really say? That's so funny. That's not how it worked. That's not how it worked. There were written copies. They weren't oral, so it's not the telephone game. They were written copies. There were multiple lines of transmission, and they still had access to the early copies. It's much more like if you said, I like red apples. The next person said, I like red apples. And the third person says, you like what? Hold on a second. Ask the first person. I said I like red apples. Gotcha. Fourth, sixth, hold on. What'd you say? I said I like red apples. Okay. And that's what happens in manuscript tradition. George Houston is a scholar. He states that literary documents were in use on an average of at least 200 years. 200 years. Tertullian, his early church father, he alludes to the fact that you can still find original, in Latin authenticate, documents still in the 2nd century when he wrote. So during his time, he alluded to the fact you can still find the originals. He said that. He said that when he talks about copies, you can still go to Corinth or still other cities and find Paul's letters. And he's writing in the 2nd century. It's highly likely that certain churches contained a master copy of a document because it was highly valued as scripture and because it was used in liturgical settings like worship. It's very, very likely that some early copy of Paul's letter to the Corinthians stayed at Corinth. And then became like the master copy. Then they would copy that from the master, and he'd go off to this church, and that's the church. And they would make copies from the master. Now, once it left there and say it made it to Ephesus or Galatia, they also make copies of the Corinthian letter correspondence, absolutely. But if it got corrupted or got messed up, they can always go back to Corinth and say, oh, hold on, here's my copy. They can always go back to the master. So it's not the telephone game. Centuries later. It's just not like that. It didn't work that way. The earliest fragments we find, like P52, like I said, they corroborate later codices. A codice that's plural for codex. For example, the Oxyrhynchus papyrus of the 2nd, 3rd centuries. There's a big fat stash of all kinds of papyrus scraps, which are amazing. So we find these scraps, we find out it's like a puzzle piece. It fits exactly what we had later on, centuries later, a whole sheet of John 4. This little piece fits in there. The spelling might be a little different and so forth. So here's an example of Oxyrhynchus papyrus 1228. So that's all it. So this is, Oxyrhynchus is in Egypt. That's just the name of the city. Papyrus, it means that's, of course, what it's composed. And that's 1228 is the number they gave, the ID. So this is it. This is the scrap. We know this was written around late 3rd century because I'm not a specialist. They can judge the Greek, the paleographers, like we were talking about, they can date it, and then, of course, carbon date it. They can date it late 3rd century. The Codex Vaticanus, which is very valuable for us. Look how complete and beautiful this thing is. This thing costs some money. It's around the mid-4th century. So when they knew, we've had Codex Vaticanus for a long time. It's Vaticanus, Codex because it's the book form. It's Vaticanus because it's at the Vatican. Of course, it's in Latin, so Codex Vaticanus. It's the mid-4th century, so mid-300s. So when they found the papyrus 1228, late 3rd century, 100 years before, it fits it. Does that make sense? So there's no time that we keep finding fragments that go, like I said, oh, Jesus is a woman? Jesus had 15 apostles? That never happens. It never happens. There will almost always be spelling errors. They don't have spell correct at all. They've got copying errors, things like that. No doubt about that. But it fits it. It fits it. So the earliest fragments we keep finding, they corroborate the later codices we have, which demonstrates, again, the basic trustworthiness of the copy process. There are no major, in textual criticism, they're called lacunae is plural, lacuna is singular. That means gap. There's no big fat gap in the narrative. Maybe the end of Mark, and I'll go there in a second. Here's an example. So this is the Dead Sea Scrolls. So here's a portion of, I think it's 1QS. I can't remember the exact scroll, 1QS. So this is an exact picture, a really good high-quality picture of one of the scrolls from the Dead Sea. And so this is again, I can't remember now what this is, the Hebrew of which biblical text. But you notice anything missing here at the bottom? All right, all this is missing. So this hole is not filled because it's a hole. We don't have other copies of the exact thing. So in these scrolls, when this happens, this gaping hole is called a lacuna. It's a gap. So what scholars then do is they look at that stuff and they start surmising what they think they might have said. And so when they translate it in the Damascus document, for example, so this is the fragment in Hebrew, which means it goes Hebrew Semitic, so it goes right to left. So it's blank, 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 and then we see this. Blank, 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 which means these blanks means they're gaping holes. Look at that. See, there's a hole there, hole there, hole there, hole. Look at bracket, 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 hole, 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 hole. So in English, in brackets, they think it might have said, for the of light to keep apart from the what. They put brackets, ways of. So dot, dot, dot. It's scholars, it's just called emendation. That is, they don't know. It's an educated guess, but we don't know. Why? Because there's a big hole. There's a gap there. Yeah, Hayden?
Don't other religions have this kind of stuff?
Any religion that has ancient documents have the same kind of problem.
So aren't they all trustworthy too? The documents?
Not all religions have the documents as well preserved as Christians do. But just because they're well preserved, first off, it does matter if they're well preserved. But like I said a second ago, just because they're well preserved, that's external data, it doesn't mean the story is accurate of what really happened. That's internal. So I can have perfect, immaculate, first century pieces of papyrus about unicorns that lived among the Martians. Perfect, perfectly kept from the autograph, the original. That's amazing. Well, that means we can trust that whoever wrote this is exactly the story they told. It's another question to ask, did that story really happen? But first, they're both very important questions, though. Does that make sense? So this is external data. I'm just trying to establish that Christians have a reason to trust that the stories themselves have been overwhelmingly accurately handed down through copies of the time. And so my point right now is, of course, is that there are no major leukemia in the New Testament. Now, before I go there, let me turn real quickly. There are no major gaps. Now, the one gap that might exist in the entire New Testament is in Mark 16. If you have your Bible, turn real quickly to Mark 16. I just want to prove this point real fast. Mark 16. So Matthew, Mark, second gospel. Mark 16 is missing its ending. Well, probably.
Oh, yeah.
And there are three different endings to Mark's gospel. Mark 16:8 is the one for which you have the best manuscript tradition. So in your Bible, after verse 8, what does it say?
Some of the earliest manuscripts do not include 16:9 through 20.
There you go. So 9 through 20. Some have a little tag at the end of verse 8. So the first ending is verse 8. The second ending is called the shorter ending of Mark, and I have that in my Greek here. The third ending is what you just said, which is verses 9 all the way to verse 9 to 20. So your Bibles will often tell you, not always, but if they're any good, they're going to tell you in a footnote or something. Other ancient manuscripts, or most manuscripts, don't have this. In scholarship, so when I read the Greek here, at the bottom of my pages, there's called a textual apparatus. I can tell which manuscripts, papyrus, blah, blah, lectionaries, which ones have it, which ones don't. And when scholars think, when it does not go to the most ancient sources, they put it in double brackets mean ain't no way it's original. Single brackets means probably not original. All the endings of Mark past verse 8 are ain't no way. So that's why, for example, that's one example. I'll give you other examples. But the argument, scholars, there's no consensus on this. Scholars have argued for a long time. Did Mark originally end his gospel in verse 8? And then later Christians in the next century or two didn't like that and they made up new endings? Or was there originally an ending, and because it's the end of the scroll, it got torn off or worn off by use all the time and it got lost? And they didn't like that, so they made up endings. Nevertheless, whatever the case is, they made up endings. But they were not the original. They would come from later documents. So if you went back to the earliest manuscripts we have, it ends in verse 8. Why it ends in verse 8, we don't know. But nevertheless, so is it a legit hole because there was something and fell away? That's possible. Or did Mark just ended his gospel and there is no hole there? There's no lacuna. It's just he stopped his gospel and they didn't like it, so they made up stuff. We don't know. But whenever there's things like that, I'm not being mean, 99% of pastors in the world don't go to training to this stuff. They don't know the difference. But I'm letting you know, that's why I never preach from those. I will never preach from Mark 16:9 to 20. Ever. Because I'm convinced it was an original to Mark. You go to hell if you read it? No. Is it of the devil? No. It just means that the earliest church, some early copyists in some early church probably said, this is going to cut. We need an ending. Matthew's got an ending. Luke's got an ending. Mark says, and they left, but they didn't tell anybody because they were afraid. I ain't no ending. Some scholars say, yes, it is, and they give arguments for it, and I can tell you what they are if you want. But
So did they base that on the other Gospels?
good question. On other Gospels and probably from Acts as well. For example, it's only in Mark's Gospel, it's in that imaginary ending, it's called the long ending of Mark, that it says, and if you handle serpents or snakes and they won't bite you, that's only there. And so the snake biting groups in West Virginia and whatnot, that you have enough faith they won't bite you. I saw a documentary of guys like, I've been bit 82 times. Like, why are you bragging about that? That means you're a sinner. You don't have faith. But anyway, I thought you'd be bragging if you had 0 bites. But that comes from one verse into that tag of ending Mark, which certainly doesn't come from the Gospels at all. That comes probably as allusion to the book of Acts, where Paul goes, he's shipwrecked on the island. Do you remember this? And a snake grabs his hand and it burns off and doesn't hurt Paul. And so there's an allusion to Paul getting bit and he's okay. And so the people around him are like, what in the world? This is a miracle. So it probably was an early copier who heard that story and go, well, if you're a real Christian, that's what happens. You must be like the Apostle Paul, where snakes can bite you and nothing goes wrong. But the other things in Mark's ending, and you can read it, come from the Gospels, such as the resurrection appearance a little bit, they run off. The tag end of Mark, of the longer ending, sounds like the end of Matthew, when Jesus says, go out and share the gospel and so forth. In fact, that ending, I'm not making fun, I'm being consistent here. Bobby had thought about putting up that ending on the wall about going out and sharing the gospel with the world. I was like, let's don't do that one. Not that it's not good, it's just probably not original. So let's go to Matthew 28:19 to 20, where it says that. On the outreach wall. Again, it's not that it's evil if you read it. And the issue is we're trying to get to the most original, closest to it, and it wasn't there. And there's a few of them, but there are in the New Testament, maybe in the Mark, if it was ripped off or whatever, then there's looking at maybe, but that's possible. So any questions there? I praise God we don't have things like this. I praise God I'm not reading on the Sunday morning and say, and then Jesus said, well, we don't know. We hope he said he loved you, Peter, and then they all died. Like, what did he say? We have nothing like that. That's really nice. Then there are things called variants. Variants are, you might say, well, they're mistakes. Well, they're changes. Variants, they're fewer than 1%. Yeah, that's cool. I meant to say this. Okay, well, I did say it. This is pretty cool. Manuscripts are found, in the earliest manuscripts, there are more breathing marks. Can't really see these. This is a little bit kind of late. These have some breathing marks here. But in the earliest manuscripts, we have certain ways, like primitive ways of breathing marks, that demonstrates that texts were used for public reading and liturgical settings. And this probably explains why Matthew's text is more stable rather than Mark's. Because Matthew's text is, the most popular gospel in the early church was Matthew. It's the one that's quoted the most, alluded to the most, and for which we have the most copies in the early church. It's highly likely that repeated liturgical use helps set the parameters. That is to say, if someone said, and then Jesus told Peter, get out of here. Everyone would say, that's not what it said. I've heard this in church all my life for 4 years. Or all the churches never said that. Where'd that come from? They know the limits. Manuscripts keep being found in monasteries, private libraries, and other places. For example, recently, a first century papyrus document, documents were discovered, and they used to do this on the inside of mummies' masks. They would take papyrus scraps to basically glue line inside of mummies' masks. The average Egyptian had linen or papyrus used in their burial, and some masks were made of papyrus with scripture on it. Because they got to be wrapped with something. Like, that scrap of nonsense. They can look through certain. Now they have apparatus and tools to look through. Scientifically, you might say, through the tools, they can analyze it, look at the ink. They can go through without having to tear it apart at all. And it's scripture. So some of our most ancient manuscripts have been keeping found by things like mummies and libraries. I just thought that was pretty neat. Okay, back to this. Okay, copyists did tend to make spelling errors. They wanted to harmonize the Gospels, like in the Mark, and they clarify ambiguities. They do, and sometimes they add new material. But there's one guy named Bart Ehrman who I studied him, and he's an atheist. He was a Christian and was a devout Christian, used to evangelize, and then lost his faith and whatever. He makes a big deal out of this. He needs, and everyone in scholarship knows he overstates the case because he still has a little fundamentalist axe to grind. There are variants, but fewer than 1%, less than 1% of the variants are what we call meaningful and viable, and none of them affect doctrine at all. Now, I'm going to show you Mark 16:9 to 14. Those are variants. So when you look at the manuscripts on the tables, and if the second one is not exactly the same as the other one, if it said, and this happens often. So if a document, I won't do it in Greek. No, how do I not do it? So if we had the autos can mean he, himself. If the breathing mark is different, and say it's like that, that's a variant. Or if you had, it doesn't really, it could be any way possible. Anytime if it said hologos, so it means the word. But if they had it the other way around, which you can perfectly in Greek. Sorry, I was talking. I can't do that and talk at the same time. Like this, it means exactly the same as the article. The word the. You can do that in Greek all the day. But that's a variant. Every time it's different, it's a variant. So people say there's tons of mistakes in the Bible. Well, I don't know. In the Bible, do you mean the manuscript traditions are mistakes? Maybe they're copying errors. Yeah, there are copying errors. But sometimes they're just delivery, because they would write these manuscripts out by hand, because they're handwritten, right? And they would look at them, and then they would, have to watch them memorize and go over here and go over here and go over here. And they had similar problems. And you can spot this very quickly. You can, if you learn Greek, you'll spot it very quickly. And they'll have a line here that's maybe it's this, and they're looking back and forth to copy their manuscript, and they go back to this next one, do line 2, and they're halfway through line 2, they accidentally go back to line 1 and then finish it here. So this part ends up being there, and they go back to line 3. They don't realize what they've done. That's called didography. You can tell they've done it because it's word for word of line 1. They're just mistakes. Later on in monasteries, they actually wrote down, today it's raining and I'm very sleepy. Like they'll put marks on the side of the manuscript. And the early manuscripts, they didn't do that. But you can see exactly what they're doing. The spelling errors. So once you learn Greek and you say, let's say this, it didn't say let's say it didn't say altos. It said altis. If you know that that's actually a different word. But if you know it in the sentence, you realize that's a type, like a typo. They didn't mean Ida there. It's a spelling error. That's a variant. That happened. Happens all the time. The question is not whether it happened. The question is, can we spot it? And the answer is yes, we can. And over 99% of these variants are completely meaningless. They're irrelevant. They're type. If my kids write a paper and I write, yeah, it's full of typos and spelling, but I know exactly what they're trying to say. And if I were to reproduce it in a copy, here's what they were trying to say, and they erased all the errors. That's it. So that's what they are. And about fewer than 1% are meaningful. One, you just looked at in Mark 16. And I gave the other ones. There's only about 7 or so that are meaningful. Martyrdom is about a dozen, and I don't find I can print through it all. I'll give you about 6 or 7. Another one that's real popular, I'll start with a minor one. I did a paper on my PhD on Mark 1:1. If you have your Bible, go to Mark 1:1 real quickly. And you'll see what I'm talking about. So this is a variant that this means Mark 1:1. Mark 1:1. Mark 1:1. So, and it says this in your gospel. It should say this, just for fun. I mean just for fun. If you want to hear it in Greek, Archi tu evangelio Iesu Christou huio theou. So in the beginning, this is the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Now, Son of God. Do you have a footnote above Son of God?
Yes.
You do. What translation? The NET?
NIV.
NIV. What does your footnote say?
Some manuscripts do not have the Son of God.
Some manuscripts do not have Son of God. That's exactly right. So in textual criticism world, that's a single bracket, not a double bracket. A single bracket, which means, And so I did a paper on my textual criticism class on that one thing, the Son of God. Did a 40-page paper, whatever it was on. Is it original or not? And I ended up saying, I don't care, it doesn't make a difference. That made the professor mad. Why'd you say that? I said, it doesn't make any difference. Because Mark makes the claim that Jesus is the Son of God in Mark's gospel other places. So it's not significant for his gospel. Not to me, it's not at all. But anyway, Mark 1. So what I'm saying one more time is that means there are some really old manuscripts, really old ones, 3rd and 4th century, that have it, and some really, really old ones that don't have it. Well, then we're like at a standstill. And so if it's a good study Bible, they're going to have footnotes that tell you, this was not made out of the original. Here's one that probably is no matter what your Bible is. Turn to John 7:53 to 8:11. This is going to hurt your feelings. This right here, I'm telling you, it's going to hurt your feelings. John 7:53 to 8:11.
Now don't hurt our feelings now.
This is it. About to hurt your feelings, I'm telling you. I didn't write the Bible. John 7:53. You should see a footnote right around verse 53.
Double brackets.
Double brackets. Yes, sir, it is. What does it say?
The woman caught in adultery.
The woman caught in adultery is not original. You know the story of the woman caught in adultery? Jesus put his finger on the sand and says, the one without sin, cast the first stone. John 7:53 through 8:11. That one story. If you, for fun, delete the story and read John 7:52 and then read John 8:12, it flows perfectly. There are other ancient manuscripts where that story shows up in Luke's gospel. It was a floating story in the early church. John 7:53.
It might feel like a little disclaimer.
Disclaimer.
The earliest manuscripts and many other ancient witnesses do not have John 7:53-11. A few manuscripts include these verses wholly or in part after John 7:36, John 21:25, Luke 21:38, Luke 24:53.
That's right. So that story or portion of that story show up in ancient manuscripts in Luke's gospel and in John's gospel, other places. No scholar thinks this is the original of John. Nobody does. Nobody. And that's also why I've never preached on this in my life. Though this is one of those popular stories in all Christianity. I'm sure everybody knows the story of one, but it's not original. It's not original. Now the question is, it's not original to John. If it was original to John, then they really messed up when they put it in Luke. But if it was original to Luke, they messed up when they put it in John. And they messed up early on, because that means within the first couple centuries, this story was already floating. It didn't have a home yet. That's one issue is it original to John? Another issue is, did Jesus ever tell the story? Those are two different issues. Scholars debate that. Scholars debate whether Jesus ever told the story, or whether no one disagrees on basically it's not original to John. This wasn't in John's gospel. This was a floating story. It landed in John 73 through 8:11. It shouldn't even be there. It's a weird spot to be there, but it is there now. It's never going to be changed now. There's no way it's stuck forever. People, you changed the word of God. People get so mad they took it out. So they just put all these big fat provisos, paragraphs. This is not original, because people would never take it. I mean, it's not going to happen now. But other issues, did Jesus say it? And I don't know. That's certainly possible Jesus told the story. But because it's not original to John, I've never preached on it, and I never will. But if sometimes I will allude to the story. I'll say, this is like the story in John 7:3 through 8:11. But that's very problematic to say. I mean, I will tell people in the sermon, I'll say, but that story's not original to John, and so forth. So is it bad to learn from it? No. But that's an example.
Do you think it was an actual story that happened? They just put it in a random spot, or do you think it was made up?
I think it's likely there is historical kernels there. I do think that's likely, for a few reasons. Yeah, for a few reasons. Yeah. When there are words or sayings or stories attributed to Jesus, not in the Gospels, we have some of those called the agraphon. For example, Paul says that 1 Corinthians, and everyone's, oh Lord, now dirt. Is it 10? When he says, as our Lord said, it's better to give than
To receive.
have you heard to receive. Paul said Jesus said that. Jesus never says that in the Gospels. But most scholars assume that probably was an early saying from Jesus. That's called an agraphon. But he never says that. Not in the Gospels he doesn't. And there's some things maybe in the Gospel of Thomas that might be original that never show up in the Gospels. And so maybe even in the 2nd century, there might be a possible few sayings of Jesus that didn't show up in the Gospels. So this might have been one of those stories that,
I don't think I'm a Christian anymore.
for some reason, I know, hurt your feelings.
So what were you talking about Luke, though? It was Luke said the story happened?
Good question. So this story of the woman caught in adultery,
Yeah.
or at least portions of that story, appear in some ancient manuscripts in Luke's Gospel.
Okay.
Which means the copiers, whoever copied it, either didn't know where to put it, or when they were told it was in Luke's Gospel, or when I heard it in church, it was in Luke's Gospel. Another guy says, when I heard it in church, it was in John's Gospel. So at some point, somewhere, that story got landed in one of those Gospels, and then it got copied.
Okay.
And then that's what you mentioned all the references. There's about 3 or 4 ancient evidences where it's in Luke's Gospel in different places in Luke's Gospel, and there's 2 or 3 different examples in John's Gospel. But eventually won the day was John's Gospel, which is why it's still stuck in our John's Gospel. But no one thinks it's original John. I mean, I shouldn't say no one, but in general, in scholarly consensus, that no one says this is. But that is a meaningful and viable variant. The woman caught in adultery is a meaningful and viable, which means we do not know the answer to the question for sure which gospel it came from. Who wrote it? We don't know. We don't know. Now, fewer than 1% of all variants make it to that category. 99.5% roughly are in this category of spelling errors, didography. Everybody knows what they are when you spot them, no big deal. And a small portion of, we're just not sure what the original was. So when someone says, can you trust the Bible, the New Testament at minimum, I say, yes, you can. Historically, yes, you can. Are you certain of every word? No, I am not. I'm not. And if you're honest, and you're not ignorant, that is, if you're honest and you're educated at all in this fact, you have to be saying, no, we're not 100% sure. We're not exactly sure. Well, how I trust any of it? Wait, what? The 0.5% of the variants that are up for grabs, it's one of these, either we said the Son of God or not. That's the case. But none of them affect doctrine. None of them.
And you're saying that what I've seen, that any archaeological finds that have been made throughout time basically have not disproved it. They've just supported it. all those, like you say, the fragments
Correct.
corroborate the code system.
Correct, it corroborates,
They've
correct.
always done that. They've never disputed it.
Not in, they've never disputed it in a major way.
Okay.
They disputed it sometimes by being, sometimes they find earlier manuscripts, they go, oh, that makes more sense of the wording there was weird, like maybe the copy's
But
messed
the
up.
story is basically.
But the story's the same,
Right.
there's no major facts, that's exactly right. So sometimes it cleans it up, oh, that makes more sense. Sometimes it makes it more, it obfuscates it. It's more ambiguous, they go, oh, whoever copied that didn't know how to copy. But they can spot it right away. Oh, they misspelled that word. They misspelled that phrase, or they copied that phrase. But they don't get the fragments as they get farther back in time. Yet no one ever. There's been 0 instances when they go, oh my goodness, now I realize he did preach a Sermon on the Mount. Never. In fact, just never. The answer is never.
Do you think we're ever going to find the originals?
No, I don't. I don't think we'll ever find the original. I think the originals are all gone. I think they were used up so much that they just destroyed. And secondly, not to mention when the Romans came in and started really destroying the churches, it was over. And not to mention Jews. Jews also attacked churches, and Christians attacked Jews, synagogues, and so forth. I think they were destroyed. I think they're used. I think as quickly, as soon as they were worn out, they copied it so much and so rapidly in different languages. That's something I'll talk about in a second. The languages, maybe I think I'll talk about. No, I think I'm about done now. But then they were copied in different languages real quickly. Syriac, Coptic, on and on. They just, like wildfire, they spread everywhere. That the original is powerful and it's good, but once it died off, they have so many, I'm sure they're convinced good copies, they don't need to keep the original anymore. I think that's exactly, so I think we'll never ever find them. It's possible, but I don't think so.
Wouldn't that be like taking the American Constitution, like copying it a ton of times and just getting rid of it?
Yeah, if it's falling apart, yeah. Today we would make sure, because of the historical significance, we might keep those fragments together unless they were burned up or literally deteriorated. We have ways of keeping those things. We keep it in a museum or in a lockbox, air pressure, blah, blah, blah. Didn't have it in the ancient world. Who's going to keep it? There's no lockbox. There's no chief authority.
You have a clay base. And that's it.
Clay, that's it. That's right. It's all gone. It's papyrus. If it gets wet, it's messed up. If it gets near fire, it's messed up. Once the first century Christians died off, Peter, James, all this stuff, they're done. So then we have different local bishops and different local churches all over the place. There's no one telling us what to do. The Church of Corinth, whatever happened to them, no one says, we got to keep this forever because one day, 2021. So Christian, there's no way they were thinking that. There's no way. They're thinking, what do we do with this? Oh, that's all destroyed. We use that something, that's fine. Well, we got a copy. Let's even better. The point of the text is not for like nerds to get around and talk about it. The point of the text was always used for worship. So you needed to read from it. Well, if it's useless, you got rid of it. Yeah, you didn't want to keep it forever. Any question about that or comments about that?
What is the no major
Lacune?
Lacune.
So remember, no major gaps. Lacune.
Okay.
I don't know why my laptop's frozen. There we go. That's weird. So there are no major lacunae, no major holes or gaps. Remember the manuscript we talked about up here? It's like the bottom.
Right.
So there's nothing like that. We go, Jesus told Mary. We don't know what that doesn't happen a lot. Except maybe then to Mark. Maybe. But any question about that? That's the external data. So my point right now is when you pick up your New Testament, we're talking about Christianity, when you pick up your New Testament, as an historian, we can say with incredible confidence that the vast majority of the words that the original documents had are present in modern Greek Bibles. And if we're not sure what the original was, and the other manuscripts down and below, one of these are right. So when I read the book of Romans and Paul's letter, I'll read the Gospels, whatever it is, I'm highly confident that the Greek words I'm reading right now are at least 99% sure are actually represent the original document itself. 99, I'm beyond 99%, 99% plus. Now, what about the 1%? We're not always sure. Like the woman caught in adultery, that's probably not, but we're more like the Son of God example in Mark 1:1. We're not exactly sure should it be there or not. That's all. Yep, that's right. So, but 99% of the time, that's it. I'm very, very confident. And then, I don't know if I say this later on, then every skeptic goes, your Bible's 12 translations. I don't know where that stopped. 12 translations removed. That's nonsense. The English translation you have in your lap right there is one translation removed from the originals. So people like me who go to school for, not like me, but even people who do nothing but specialize in Greek, they show up on a committee of other people just like them who spent their entire life in Greek, and they translate from the original manuscript, not the original autograph, the ones we have, the most ancient ones, and decide which one should be translated. And they translate to the English. Every English translation is from the best manuscripts we have. Every one of them. So you have the ESV, right? You have the ESV. So ESV is a translation, English Standard Version. The New International Version. I have the RSV. These are all different English translations. You have the Inuit. So we have 4 different translations. All 4 of these Bibles came from committees from the Greek. My version didn't come from your version, which came from your version. No. That's not how it works. It's every English translation is only one translation away from the original. And same thing with Hebrew.
So I got a question for you, and I'm not trying to go against what you're, I'm just trying to figure something out for myself. Because before the King James Version, 1611, there's the Bishop's Bible, there's the Geneva Bible also. So where would those have, I'm just curious, where would those have come from, those groups of men that wrote that? Where would those...
Good, that's a good question. Well, we will talk a lot more about that when I do How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth. But the short story is there were many different translations before the King James Version. There were many.
Sure.
Yeah, there were several English translations, and people got burned at the stake because of it.
Yep.
Modern translations are, regardless of what the King James lovers are, and I've talked to some, and they mean well.
Right.
Every modern translation in English, every one of them is better than the King James Version. Because we have way more manuscripts now than the King James did. They had about 4, 5, 6 major manuscripts from which to work. We have thousands. We know more of Greek. We know more, the Greek language than they knew. We have thousands of more manuscripts than they had. We just know much more about the Bible than they did, period. So they did a great job with what they had. That's it. We know way more. So every single time, and I've got examples in How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth. I've got examples when I talk about what translations are and how some are better than others. And I give examples of the King James Version. So the King James Version might say virgins, but in the Greek, the New Modern says donkeys. Like, which one is it? The King James said, whatever King James, it's wrong. Guarantee it. I just guarantee. Like, when in doubt, King James is wrong. That's the case. So is it pretty? Yeah, it's pretty. But it's no New Testament scholar. None of us. You never study the King James Version. Nobody cares about the King James. Nobody cares about the King James Version. If you're in scholarship, you don't read from English anyway. You read from Greek or Hebrew. If you're an Old Testament scholar, you read from Greek. You don't care about English translations. So I always say, what's the best? What do scholars use? And they debate about that stuff. We don't debate about English translations. You don't. I'm just saying I'm sounding sassy because I've talked so many times to skeptics and atheists about this who are so ignorant about it, and they sound so confident and persuasive to Christians. I'm trying to tell you that it's not like that. It's just not like that. When I had my class in Mark and PhD, you don't read from the English. Everybody's got the Greek New Testament open. If you have Romans and Philemon, all the class I did, they're all Greek. You don't, and that's problematic enough because then you talk about textual criticism and which ones. You're going back to that. You don't debate that stuff. So you can trust your translations. I'm telling you. What team got together, there were people who spent their entire lives on Greek. And yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Not to get on a tangent, but if you had to what do you think the King James onlyness, what their deal is? What do you think they latch? What do you think they've latched onto? And why do you think they won't budge on?
I've asked the King James Version only. I have a little story about that I might tell. I might wait for my How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth. I've asked them, what is it? Give me your best arguments for it, because I want to hear. I don't want to be wrong myself. So what is it? Usually the number one the one I've heard the most from them is the nut and round drop down argument is it was the translation used during one of the Great Awakenings, the revival movement. So it affected and served the church's needs so well. That was it. To which I say, wouldn't you think the primitive church was the most powerful, important movement of the early church, the first, say, 5 centuries of the church that gave us all the councils? Well, that wasn't a King James, that was Greek. But they didn't know. The answer is no. The Great Awakening, that's the one. It is that translation. That's the one that God inspired. That's the translation that counts. And I asked another guy, I said, but what do you do, seriously, what do you do with the fact that we have way more ancient manuscripts than what King James translators had at the time. And his response was what he'd heard from other people. When he became a Christian, he did from YouTube, and there were King James only people. And as usual, when we become a Christian, they just, like we are, little sheep, they were so excited. They don't want to betray their, faith fathers. And I know, and that was his deal. He said, just because it's older doesn't mean it's right. And I go, I concur. But he goes, well, that was it. Well, I didn't say it's necessarily the case, but don't you think it's more likely it's the case that if a document, say, is 200 years older, it's probably a little more accurate to the original than when it came out hundreds of years after the fact? And he just looked at me. I said, is that not even more probable to you? He goes, well, it's not necessarily the case. I go, I agree it's not necessarily the case. But isn't that more commonsensical that if something is centuries before? And for him, that was his stuff. And I go, well, for me it is. For me, that's commonsensical. If I find anything that's older, I'm going to listen to it.
And also, good argument for that as far as, well, this is just a slight off of what you're talking about. So the Pilgrims came over here in 1620, or Jamestown was 1608. The Pilgrims was 1620. So if the Pilgrims got here in 1620, the Bishop's Bible was, I believe, 1548. So the Geneva Bible and the Bishop's Bible, which were written in the 1500s, there were a whole lot more bishops and Geneva Bibles. So there's a really good argument that the first Bible to the United States, the colony, was the Bishop's Bible.
I don't think it's going to persuade them, but
right.
I think there's a deep emotional, and the people they respect have told them over and over and over, this is the truth, this.
Yeah.
I find that overwhelmingly unpersuasive. There's zero, I have never heard anything remotely close to something persuasive, ever. For an English translation to be, and I always said, why care about why care about English anyway? Why don't you go translate from the Greek and Hebrew? Why not read what they actually wrote? Paul didn't write in English. The English language didn't exist. Well, it's the best. No, it's not. I can't get it. With due respect, I can't get it. I don't get it at all. Here's an example of something that's very ancient. We have, let's say this is the year 0, and we're over here in 2021. For the Old Testament, and I'll talk a lot more about this and how to read the Bible for all its word. The oldest copy of the scroll of Isaiah that we possessed of the time was around 800 AD, the fullest scroll. And that was in Hebrew. The oldest Greek translation of Isaiah, the earliest Greek translation of Isaiah came from around, I think it was around 200 or so AD. That's in Greek. So forever, Bible translations were based off really the Greek translation. So your Old Testament was largely based off the Greek translation, which is called the Septuagint. It's the Bible that Paul used because they didn't speak Hebrew. And Jews didn't know Hebrew by the time of Jesus and Paul much. They knew Greek. And so when Paul alludes to the Old Testament in your Bible now, if you look at the quotes, if you get real technical about it, he almost quotes always from the Septuagint. This is the Greek translation. But then we found the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls, we found a whole entire scroll of the book of Isaiah. And it dates to around 200 BC. So overnight, and this is in Hebrew, we time traveled 1,000 years. Overnight. So do you think textual critics were excited to see whether or not the copying process had been pretty good, or horrible, or fantastic, for 1,000 years of translating and copying Hebrew? They compared notes. This ancient Isaiah text from the Dead Sea Scroll, all the way whatever. What do you think? How well do they do?
Badly.
They did fantastic.
Blew up.
They did fantastic. They were overwhelmingly similar for 1,000 years of copying Hebrew. Now, there's probably reasons for that, and they give because of da-da-da. And just because they're fantastic doesn't mean every single manuscript is fantastic. It's not. But that's amazing. That's the kind of stuff that happens. So a King James Version would say, so what? It doesn't matter. It's 1,000 years before. I go, but Isaiah was written around well, it's probably 2 or 3 different Isaiahs, but anyway, let's give the earliest date, so 8th century BC, all the way to the 7th century BC. So 500 years before then is our earliest manuscript. Don't you want to get closer? Instead of being 1,500 years removed, don't you want to be only 500 years removed? It just makes sense to me to think, if there's any differences between the Dead Sea Scroll copy and what we had, I want to go with the Dead Sea Scroll copy because it's more likely to be original. And that's what scholars do, and that's what they did, which means now a lot of the manuscript, your Old Testament and Isaiah is chiefly based on the Dead Sea Scrolls because it's in Hebrew because it's older. And that's what, that was in the 40s, the Dead Sea Scrolls 40s, which means, y'all are all alive and well by that. I'm kidding. So that's an example of things that keep being found, and they're ancient. Every once in a while we find stuff, we humans, not me, but every once in a while things are found in mummies. Any other questions? Anything else? So
No.
I think there's good reason to trust it.
Now, is there anything, have you ever heard anything about the Philippine Dead Scrolls?
No, Philippine Dead Scrolls. I have not heard. No. Philippine Dead Scrolls. Okay, so we're going to move from external to internal. Now the question is the stories of the Gospels, I'm being very specific now because we're talking about Christianity, I'm focusing on Jesus. I'm going to really, really focus on the Gospels on purpose. Okay, I'm going to zoom in on the Gospels. Because if Paul was a lunatic liar, Christianity is still true. I need to know if the basic life and teaching and death and resurrection is true, then Christianity is true. So I'm going to focus in on the Gospels. So the external evidence data tells me the Gospels I can trust with about 99% accuracy the words are the same. The issue is the Gospels themselves, can they be trusted to actually represent what really happened in Jesus' life? Does that make sense what I'm saying? Okay. So, again, they tell us the most about Jesus. Now, we have very good reason to trust that, at least in general, the Gospels accurately represent the life and teaching of Jesus. Nothing I'm about to say will make it certain, but instead, to me, very probable, and here's why. The first one is this. The Gospels are an ancient form of bios, or bios, and we get the word biography from that. And bios just means life. Okay? Let me say a few things about that, and I think you've got plenty of room in your handout for this. We're on page, what, is it page 8?
Yep.
Oh, if you have any questions about more textual criticism, I gave you stuff at the top of page 8. You see that in the books? You can read all kinds of great things about that. Okay, so on page 8. First off, every single specialist in the field is convinced that Jesus existed. Everybody is. If you hear anybody, and I know I can tell you who they're going to be.
Who?
Richard Carrier. He's the only person with a PhD in history who claims that Jesus never existed.
Who else?
But he's not in the field. He does something else. But nobody in Roman history, biblical, nobody from, Bart Ehrman, Mr. Atheist himself, wrote a whole book saying, yes, he existed. We know a whole lot about Jesus. And the Jesus never existed camp hates him for that. They hated his book. Of course they did, because they love Bart when he agrees with them. Atheists love Bart when he can be used for their ends. When he disagrees with them, they hate him. That's how it is. Everybody thinks that. I'm telling you, if anybody says, well, even if he existed, you're talking to a person who has zero training in the historical work of the first century. I don't care if he worships Satan. No historian denies that. The only person I know about all in the world is Richard Carrier, and he's not convinced any other historian. He hasn't. Not that I know of any of them. And nearly every historian would add that Jesus lived in Palestine in the first century. He was crucified under Pontius Pilate. And the people who disagree with that, they're called Jesus mythicists. It's just a myth. They're popular on YouTube and blogs, but they're not in scholarship. So please don't waste your time. I'm telling you, I'm trying to save you time. You can read them, you can listen to them, go for it. All I'm saying is if you start getting all into it and you get confused, I'll be happy. I'm not afraid of arguments. I've read Richard Carrier, his major points. He wrote a massive monograph a few years ago. I didn't read the whole, it's like 700 pages or something. I read his massive points on his blog. I read those things. They're not at all persuasive to me, and I don't know any historian to whom they're persuasive. And if you want afterwards, I can tell you what his arguments are. But they're bios. Gospels, secondly, they cannot be in the genre of ancient novel, because ancient novels were almost always romances. Gospels aren't romantic at all. And Jewish novels typically relied very little on other historical works, but the Gospels constantly quote from the Old Testament, which the Jews overall viewed as historical. So why aren't the Gospels like ancient novels? Because they don't fit the criterion at all. They don't fit the criteria. And well, why can't they be historical novels? You know, David, and I've heard this before. David, I hear you, I've talked to you online about this. Captain America's in World War II. They get all the facts about World War II right. And then there's this fictional character called Captain America, and he fights off Hitler as a red dude face. So all around it's true. We call it maybe a historical novel. The main character, though, is all fictional. That's what the Gospels are. The response is no. The Gospels are almost certainly not that, because historical novels in the ancient world are very, very rare. And they typically don't contain people in the recent past. They'd be the distant past. The Gospels are not in the distant past. They're referencing someone that just happened a couple decades ago. And the Gospels contain an overwhelming amount of historical anchors. And I'll talk about that in a second. Things that can be corroborated. So if it's a historical novel, like Captain America, we're going to start talking about whole teams of people and ships and lands and things that we know for a fact are not real. The Gospel's not like that. It's not like that at all. And I'll talk about that more like it. There are an enormous amount of historical anchors. It's not a historical novel. It's not a normal novel. It's not romantic. It's not a historical novel. I can go off a long list. It's not a cookbook. It's not a fairy tale. It doesn't fit the genres. It doesn't fit the criteria. It's David's hagiography. It's a text written to praise some sacred character. Okay, if it is, it's the earliest known form of ever existence. Those didn't come to popularity by the 3rd and 4th century. So it can't be, it's not that either. Almost every single New Testament scholar concurs. The Gospels are, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are various types of the ancient biography, which was a form of history. That is what actually happened. Bios was a kind of history. It's not the same as history. Historia in Latin. They wrote those too. Tacitus wrote that. Polybius wrote that. Herodotus wrote that. Gospels are not historia. They're a subcategory of history. Subcategory called bios, life of a person. And the gospel, they're bios. They're especially actually what happened if they're written in living memory of the protagonist. So it can't be the Lord of the Rings. It's not the Lord of the Rings. It's just like that. I've heard it. Oh, dummy. You think it's Harry Potter. You think Harry Potter came to life. No, we don't. Where on the map is Harry Potter located? Where's any corroborating evidence? Where are the historical anchors for all the stuff that happens? Julia. Hogwarts. Where's Hogwarts? It's nowhere, that's right.
Behind a railroad station.
Railroad station.
Yeah, this is kind of off topic. Do you know what the Council of Nicaea in 380 is? Apparently, it's the birthplace of Jesus, like he was conceived. The idea.
I do. It's the Council of Nicaea, and it was in 380. Who said that?
380.
300 AD. It says 300 AD. That doesn't make.
Well, what
The
is
Council of Nicaea, the first one was in 325, not 300.
Oh.
So they even got that wrong. Jesus wasn't born. Yeah, it's a common idea amongst atheists.
So, like, it's like the idea, so not actual Jesus. Like, he wasn't a baby, he was like.
How is an idea? I'm not sure. No, I've never heard people say it's an idea. Council of Nicaea. What I have heard people say is that the Council of Nicaea is when Jesus was all of a sudden became divine. Before then, he was human. That's like in the Da Vinci Code and Dan Brown. That nonsense, and that is nonsense.
Good question, Hayden.
That's nonsense.
Good
A PhD in historical theology, I can tell you from, that's nonsense. So, bios is a form of history, especially when it's a living memory of the protagonist and the living memory of the witnesses. That's what happens. So, there are several signs that huge portion of the Gospels come from eyewitness testimony. Several signs. I think I've got, okay. It's important to note that there are things, I don't have time, but there are signs of that. It doesn't prove it, just makes it more likely. If you were looking for signs, if you were saying, let's say this is based on eyewitness testimony, what are the kind of things you'd find? And you would find things like random names attached to story. Random meaning names attached to stories that are insignificant to the story. Like in Mark's Gospel, in Mark 15, when Jesus goes and it says, and as Simon the Cyrene is forced to carry the cross of Jesus, the father of Rufus, and what's his name? Now, why mention that? It's extremely likely because the person who told the story, Rufus, is in that church. And he told the story. My dad told me he's the one who helped carry the cross. You have these kind of anecdotal things where the story is told and the names are attached to it. And there's a bunch there. But there's all kinds of signs. It doesn't mean all of it is, Means there are a lot of telltale signs and things like that. And I'm going to talk more about that in a second to give more evidence as we go along. I will. Now, it's important to note that the sayings of Jesus seem to be typically reproduced more carefully than the narrative sections. Presumably because the sayings material come from Jesus. Like, for example, when Jesus talks, there are numerous Aramaisms. Aramaic, that is, things from Aramaic. Things that in Greek, it's funky Greek. They go, it's probably because it's a literal translation straight from the Aramaic. And sometimes the Aramaic just comes through, just straight comes through. So Jesus says to the little girl who's sick, Talitha kum. That's Aramaic, means rise, saying rise. He says on the cross, the cry of their election in Matthew 15, and he says, Mark. And he says, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. It's in Aramaic. Now Matthew puts it in Hebrew, because his audience may be like he's referencing the Old Testament. He says, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. You have things like that. Jesus says, there's no Aramaisms like that. He says, Abba. Abba means, of course, like Father. But so those kind of things. So the narratives, the gospel writers seem to be a little more fluid on those, but the sayings seem to be reproduced more. And not everything lines up perfect in the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, which is fine to the authors of the New Testament. When you wrote an ancient biography, you were free to change the details and chronology and vocabulary within reason. And Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus is arrested because of the temple scene. He overturns the money changers' temples, the changer tables, and he gets in trouble. In John's Gospel, that's not why he gets arrested. John's Gospel, he does at the very beginning of his ministry. But they go, boy, he's a liar. People who wrote biographies did not have a problem changing the chronology, because that's not the point. The point of a biography is to demonstrate a main character and tell the life of that person. And they had a lot of wiggle room and nuance of how they want to tell the story they can. But all the events in the story emphasize the character of the main character. And so Jesus tells us saying, and I mean, this happens all the time in the Gospels. He'll say someone a saying, and they'll look at him confused, like, what is he talking about? What does that parable mean? People go, those dumb disciples, they're so dim-witted. What a bunch of morons. That's not how they understood biography. Biography is not about the other characters in the story. It doesn't tell us that the characters in the story are dim-witted and morons. It tells us that Jesus sometimes is confusing. Sometimes Jesus taught things that people don't understand. The point is always about Jesus, which is a little footnote. You will never hear me preach sermons that everybody else does, which is a whole sermon series on Peter. I will never do that. Peter is never the point.
Did we go to that one time? It was a big church. I don't remember where. He was saying on the stage in like a diver suit, talking about the three women in the Bible. One was like an adulterer. One was
a different women.
I think in the Old Testament. You did a whole sermon on that.
Yeah, I won't.
Whole
sermon on Moses and his leadership capacities.
Yeah, pretty broad.
He's not the point. Anyway, that's different. He's not the point. It's always the point is, what does this tell me about the character of Jesus? Sometimes he was hard to understand. Sometimes he was angry with his disciples. Sometimes he was very happy with his disciples. Sometimes he walked on water and did the miracle. Sometimes he said, forget you, don't touch me, and he avoided the crowds. It's always points to him. That's what biography is. So the biography is a kind of history where they had freedom to go around, no doubt about it. I need to make this one more last point. I'm trying to make, and I'll say more about this and how to read the Bible for all its worth. But a biography is not a stenographic record. And that's the normal perception of every Christian I've ever met. They think when they read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, these authors sat down and went, and wrote down everything. Now, Matthew himself probably did take notes, and there's reason to think that. But they're not stenographic reference. Let's start at the beginning. Jesus was born on December. We don't have that. Today, if I read a biography about Winston Churchill, that's how they'll start. He was born, all the context, historical literature, they'll get all the letters, all the documents, and get, as best they can, the best details of how it happened. That is not a biography. A biography is not a news article. It's not an editorial. It is not a stenographic record in a courtroom. It is not that. It is not that. Biography was a kind of genre. But the people took the data from living eyewitness testimony as much as they could, and written material, but they would, if there was a lie they could tell, they would go to the live person first. There's a Roman historian, Polybius, said, always trust the living voice more than the written. And so if you had living testimony, you go talk to them and get the data. If you had manuscript or stories, that's fine. But then it was their job as the author to compile what they wanted, to leave out what they didn't want to talk about, and only write what they did want to talk about it, and write it in such a way to make the point you're going to make. Which means they'll shave things off, change vocabulary, move it around chronology to make the point about whatever the main character is. trying to make sure that point.
Sorry, that's
Sure.
sorry, it's okay. Okay, Pastor David. I heard it in the Moody Radio. They have a question about Christmas, and the first people who celebrated the first one, the very first one who celebrated Christmas is Alabama. So why is Alabama is the first one who celebrated Christmas? Not everybody the same time.
I've never heard that in my life, that Alabama.
It's in the Moody Radio. They asked the question. Said the first one who celebrated Christmas, who are they? And then the answer is Alabama. So it's not Illinois, it's Alabama, state of Alabama. The first one.
The first people to celebrate Christmas were from Alabama.
Yeah.
That's demonstrably false.
Already?
Absolutely. Alabama didn't exist when they started celebrating Christmas. Christmas started being celebrated in the 4th and 5th century. So there was no United States of America back then. That was about 2,000 years, 1,500 years after that fact. So
I
that's
don't know.
weird.
We have to ask that to Ken.
Yeah, and who said
Because
that?
they asked that in the question, like
Who did?
Bible trivia, like that.
Moody Radio.
Moody Radio.
Yeah, it's in the Moody Radio last year or 2 years ago.
Okay,
They asked,
I believe you. I believe you, yeah.
Mindbender trivia, the name, the questions.
Yeah.
Every morning they ask every 8 o'clock. And
Maybe they meant a certain tradition of Christmas started in Alabama, maybe something like that.
Yeah,
But
maybe.
the celebration of Christmas did not start in the state of Alabama.
Dad, you didn't write an angry letter to me.
No. He's kidding. He's
How
kidding.
dare you.
He's just joking. But that's absolutely false.
Okay.
There's not even a shadow. That's absolutely false. The earliest recorded date for the Christmas comes probably from the Alphabets around 175, 180. But the early 200s, or the 3rd century, the Christians were starting to say December 25th. And then by the early to mid 300s, it was much more popular. But it became kind of locked in stone around 525 AD, when the Pope Leo asked a monk called Dionysius Exiguus II come up with the date of Jesus' birth, and he came up with a date. He was wrong. He was about 4 to 6 years off. But he started with December 25th, and that became the official Christmas day. But by then, for centuries, though, people had already been celebrating the birth of Jesus around that time anyway, because the standard belief was that there's several reasons why, but one is the belief that they thought the first day of the universe of creation was on April 25th.
Why?
And they thought it had to have been the same, it was a common belief they had. Because the vernal equinox, the vernal equinox of the first day of the year where the sun gets longer in the time period, it's really April 20th to 21st. But in the ancient world, they thought it was the 25th. We know our measurements are very exact now. And April 25th is the first day where the sun's the day gets longer, so it must be the first day of creation, which means if the Word became flesh, he had to be just like that. He's the light of the world. He had to be conceived then, which means 9 months after April 25th is December 25th. So they're theological reasons. It's not at all a historical reason. But that was already celebrated for a few centuries before that Pope at the time in the Western Church. The Western Church said, that's got to be the official date. The Eastern Church said, I don't care what you say because I don't care what the Pope says. All the Greek speakers said, I don't give a rip. They started celebrating on January 6th. They did that for different reasons. They had already had a celebration of a guy, a heretic. He ended up being a heretic. Basilides, he was a Gnostic, and he believed that Jesus was adopted as God's son. He wasn't born the son of God. He was adopted. It's called adoption of Christology. He was very popular in the early church. He taught that, and he could persuade a lot of Christians, a lot of churches. And he said the day that Jesus was adopted, he was called the day of Epiphany. Epiphanos in Greek means he appeared. He appeared to be the Son of God at his baptism. And so that day, he said, was January 6th. And so Christians in the East said, well, we'll keep the day. You're just wrong. It's not the day it's not the day at baptism he was the Son of God. It was his birth. So they kept the date he already had, just said, your theology's wrong. But they still disagreed on that.
Does that exist anymore? Or is that kind of
That's all gone. It's in popular level churches. They don't know they're being Gnostic, but they are. But as far as official people saying, I'm a Gnostic, you won't find that much.
I think you should introduce a month-long sermon series on each
On Gnosticism.
disciple in the Bible.
Yeah, I know. No, so all that to say, it was around for a long time. It was not Alabama.
Okay.
With due respect to whoever said that, they're mistaken on history. That's yeah. And with due respect, I've heard a lot of bad things on the radio and YouTube. I've heard a lot of nonsense, and but a lot. Things get, I call them church legends. They're things that pass on to the church, pass on to the church, pass on to lunch, and I've heard them a lot, and I forget how many are out there until I hear people say them again. I forget because that's all right. And I'm gonna say this pretty quickly. In a few minutes left, can we go on? Is that okay? Very quickly. So it is an ancient biography. Gospels record characters who are corroborated outside the New Testament. They record characters outside the New Testament. That is to say, if you look up, and here's several of them. Roman emperors. These are all emperors we know. These are characters we know for a fact they existed because we have other literature and some archaeological inscriptions that prove it. Kaiser or Caesar Augustus, Tiberius Claudius, Pontius Pilate, Sergius Paulus, Gallio, Felix, Festus. I mean, on local rulers, prominent men, all these characters in the Gospels, they're all corroborated. We know these characters. They're all, many other literature at the time period talks about them. So again, this isn't like Harry Potter. This isn't Gandalf of Lord of the Rings and Elf or whatever. These are some major characters. And let that sink in. These are some major characters, not minor characters. In other words, if these characters didn't exist, it's very, very problematic. If it said the first time Jesus ruled on the emperor, the Roman governor, technically a prefect, of Pontius Lizinus, and there is no Lizinus. Like, what are you talking about? But we know there's Pontius Pilate, and we know the exact time period fits perfectly what the gospel said of the events that took place. I mean, it's just.
Were there any people that we didn't know about until the Bible that were?
Yes. Yeah. Well, not no, but yeah. But as far as historically, yeah, Pontius Pilate barely has any information about him. He was a Roman prefect. There's not like any literature at all in the ancient world about him, but we have some, and some other characters that are barely mentioned. But anyway, not many. So there are characters corroborated outside the New Testament. That's proof. Third, Gospels record locations that are corroborated outside the New Testament. Josephus was a Jewish historian, and he talked a lot he's around at the same time period, around the 1st century. And a lot of what we know about Judaism and Israel at the time period comes from Josephus. And we can compare what the Gospels say, what's going on in Galilee and Jerusalem, whatever, and we compare it to what Josephus said. About 80% of Josephus' locations are corroborated. About 80% of them. So he lists cities and towns that we don't know of. 81% of the Gospels. So we're almost exactly the same of a person who lived in the same time period. There's other documents called the Apocryphal Acts that no scholar thinks are original, but the Apocryphal Acts of Paul and Thecla, Apocryphal Acts of Thomas, Apocryphal Acts of Andrew, they're worthless. I mean, they're just worthless.
I got a question for you right there. What's your thoughts on the value of the several books of the Maccabees?
The one and two Maccabees in particular, are invaluable for what's going on in Israel before the birth of Jesus. So the so-called Maccabean revolt around 166 BC to 163 BC, yeah, almost everything we know about it comes from the books of the Maccabees. And most historians trust it as accurate. Some of the stuff certainly have some kind of legendary accretions, but as far as basic political maneuvers, what went on, yeah. Okay. They're very helpful for that, for right before Jesus. Right. So about 100, 150 years beforehand. And that helps us make sense of a lot of things. For example, Shimeon, Simon Peter, he was named after the great warrior of the Maccabean revolt. Simon, Simeon. So a lot of those names that we even used for the disciples themselves, there's some hints that there's some political fervor still running in the family because they're naming them after the great heroes of Jewish faith.
Wow.
Another little footnote. When Judas Maccabeus was the great revolt, when the do it.
Don't do it.
Some things help us. So, for example, there are the Syrian kings who came in. His name was Antiochus IV. They call him Epiphanes, which means madman, Epimanes. But he called himself Epiphanes, the great one. They made fun of him. He came down to Israel, and he set up mock priests. He brought in his own priests. Eventually came into Jerusalem, brought pigs in on the altar, and people went crazy. And this is referenced in the book of Daniel, particularly in the latter parts, in different language, chapter 7 to 12. They call it the desolation of sacrilege. That's what they called it. And every scholar, besides fundamentalists, every other scholar thinks in Daniel 7 to 12, it's referencing that event. That desolation of sacrilege references when Antiochus Epiphanes brought a pig into the temple. That exact vocabulary, desolation of sacrilege, is what Jesus uses in Mark 13.
Wow.
To use as the metaphor for when you see the junk hit the fan at the temple, and it did in AD 70. Another thing, the little footnote is, when he came in, and then what happens after all he started doing this, these puppet priests came everywhere. The Maccabean is a family. It looked at me as of the hammer. They were a different family, but they had a big family, and they got so fed up, they eventually attacked one of the local priests, a local town, like a local Kiwani. They killed the priest on the altar, killed the local little priest, and then they started a guerrilla warfare movement. They fought against. And then around 165 BC, they won their independence. When he came into the temple, the main guy, Simon, the main hammer, when he came in to liberate and they call it cleanse the temple, when he was on his way there, he rode a donkey and they put palm branches down. They waved palm branches. Wow. And so every scholar believes that's exactly why, of course, in the Gospels, when Jesus comes, the same thing happens. And their recent memory of 130 years earlier, which for a lot of them is recent memory because Mama told it, the grandmama told the story. Remember that time? Because only for those 3 years, the next time Israel would be independent from the Maccabean revolt, because in 163 it stopped, about 3 years of independence. The next time is 1947. Wow. So from 163, then they're still there. Then they go into Greek, Roman occupation and all the occupations. So when Jesus comes into town and they're waving palm branches, there's no way they weren't thinking, the last time we did this, our great Jewish hero came in and cleansed the temple. Jesus comes in and it's overwhelmingly anticlimactic. In Mark 11, he comes in, he looks at it, and then leaves and curses the fig tree. Later on, he comes back and it returns the money changer. But he doesn't kill the Romans. He didn't cleanse the temple. He doesn't. In fact, what Jesus does is condemn the temple. And if you're an ancient Jew, that stands out. No wonder they turned to a mob. We thought this guy was going to go cleanse the temple. He just cursed it and said, "You're worthless now." That's not what we wanted at all. Where's Judas? Come on, dude. So little things like that we learn from the Maccabean revolt, the 1 or 2 Maccabees that help inform probably what the ancient thinking. Actually, I'm going to stop. I guess I'm on this little part here. Simon Gathercole compiled the data. Josephus was Palestinian. He knew Galilee very well. And yet the Gospels do better than he does. They do better. And here, for example, in the apocryphal Gospels and the apocryphal Acts, these are Gospels you never heard of because you're in church, that's fine. But I mean, it's called the Gospel of Truth and the Gospel of Mary. There are no places mentioned at all. The Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Judas, the only 2 places mentioned are the world and Judea. The Gospel of Philip says the world and Jerusalem. The Sophia of Jesus Christ, which means the wisdom, places of Mount Olivet, and he puts Mount Olivet in Galilee, which is clearly not. The infancy Gospel of Thomas is the region of Bethlehem and the town of Nazareth. If you don't know, that's silly. Bethlehem's a town, not a region, and Nazareth is a region, not a town. He gets it backwards. The Gospel of Barnabas said Jesus sailed to his city of Nazareth. You don't sail to a city of Nazareth; it's not near the sea.
They made all that stuff up.
It's not. Yeah, they don't know what they're talking about. Gospel of Philip has extensive discussion of the temple, completely wrong. So when you look at other documents that came about 100 years after the Gospels, they're worthless. They're worthless. They don't help us at all. Forget if we even had the Gospels. If we just all found these apocryphal Acts and we just compared it to Josephus or the Romans, who go, these things, what were they smoking? They're way off. When you read the Gospels, not like all of that. You read the Gospel and you go, that fits perfectly. That's exactly what you expect. Now, it's around 81%. It doesn't mean the other ones have been disconfirmed. It means they haven't been corroborated yet, if that makes sense. They didn't corroborate yet. So there are towns and villages we will probably never, ever find the records because they're so small. They're like Neponsit or Laura or whatever. They're the sands of time. Other towns are built on top. They're probably never going to find. Maybe they will. And I've got tons more archaeology things there. It's still a new field. Biblical archaeology is relatively new, but there are numerous archaeological finds that corroborate the Bible and the Gospels, this kind of stuff all the time. We have a 1st century synagogue inscription at Caesarea that proves Nazareth was a town in the time of Jesus. We have inscriptions from Augustus that proves 3 different censuses were taken at Jesus' birth. We have numerous excavations proving that Herod the Great was ruling when Jesus was born, along with excavations proving Herod Antipas ruled in Galilee. We've uncovered portions of the synagogue in Capernaum where Jesus taught, and I've been there twice. We have uncovered the remains of Peter's actual house in Israel, which actually I'm showing in the sermon on Sunday. We have the bone box, the ossuary of James, Jesus' brother. And we have the ossuary, the bone box, of the high priest who helped sentence Jesus to death, Joseph Caiaphas. We have his bone box. That's proof he existed.
And they put bones in there. Why?
You put them in the cache, a little groove inside of a tomb for a year, and when it deteriorates, they come back every year anniversary, took all his bones, put it in a box, they had scripture name on it, put one on the shelf.
Wow, how cool
Yeah,
is
we
that?
have his bone box. We have Jesus' brother's bone box.
They have bones in them, or they?
Yeah.
That's cool.
I don't know about Jesus' brother, but Caiaphas thing does. We have a large portion of a first century boat that would have been used by Jesus and his disciples. But that same boat, and I've been there too, they call it the Jesus boat, I presume. We have inscriptions that prove Pontius Pilate's rule during Jesus' life. And that's just a sample.
And that's not mentioned in any other text besides the Bible.
No, it means it's corroborated. It means we have well, the text maybe not. It's archaeological stuff. It's rocks, boats, inscriptions that proves it.
Couldn't they still have made it up if they lived in that time period? Could have just named time.
Yes, they could have said, there's a guy named Pontius Pilate who's the governor and prefect of Judea. They could have, that's logically possible. Then the question is, why would they do that? Why make up the ruler?
Famous.
You have to make an argument and present that at a scholarly conference, see if it convinces people. You know what? You'd have to confirm that. Because not only do we find the archaeological evidence, then we find the archaeological evidence inscription fits perfectly what we find in literary evidence. If you remember at all what I said last week, when I said, I know you memorized it, I said when historians try to figure out something really happened, the knockdown, drag out, we're sure of it, is when it's both in literary evidence and archaeological evidence. Then we know it's for sure. That's things like Pontius Pilate and whatever. The second is we just have archaeological evidence. Someone wrote that down. You have to demonstrate that a bunch of liars made it anyway, that's all. Well, we're out of time on that issue. Any other questions or comments? Yep.
Why Charles Spurgeon, he has heavy English?
Was Charles Spurgeon heavy English?
Yeah,
Has heavy,
His English is also heavy.
heavy English.
Heavy English.
Yeah.
Sorry.
You know, have you read the Charles Spurgeon?
Yeah, Charles Spurgeon has heavy English, that's right. Well, I'm thinking a few times when I'm seeing you, I feel badly because I know, well, some of these words are new for English speakers too, I'm guessing, like lacunae and stuff. I'll say a quick prayer, we'll close this out, and I'll stick around if you want. Thank you, God, very much for the opportunity to study this material. So help us to learn more. Of course, more of you, that's the most important thing, but also about you and how you work through history. Help this information be good and useful for our own faith and bolstering the fact that we have reason to trust this is rationally acceptable. And secondly, when we talk to people who have questions, maybe we have some answers for them as well, and help them on the path to accepting you. We love you. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
You stop. You think?